Welcome to the video presentation for Chapter 2 in Crime Scene Investigation. Take a look in this particular presentation about the value of first responders and how they play into the investigative process of human bondage. This is a quote from that. Follow your inclination with due regard to the policeman around the corner. That's one of the first responders who could potentially be at a crime scene, but not the exclusive one. You also have rescue personnel, firefighters, you have citizens, you have the examiner, and others. So we're going to talk about notes and notes that are taken, the top priority of what we should be concerned about whenever we arrive at what they call a fresh crime scene, important first steps. We'll talk about protecting the crime scene. And this is an important thing to remember, that to a great extent how the successful the crime scene investigation is in gathering evidence, and of course that is what we're trying to do when we're talking about crime scene investigation, depends quite a bit upon what that first responder does. So whoever it is who is first at the scene, they can impact the scene positively or negatively as far as the extended investigation goes. The very first thing that we have to be concerned about in a fresh crime scene, and particularly those where someone has been hurt, like a attempted homicide or something of that nature, a shooting, a stabbing, it's safety. So it's the safety of the people who are there, and we'll talk more about that coming up. Once we have established the safety for both the citizens, the police officers, or any other personnel in the area, then we can worry about protecting the evidence that is available. So there's various levels of crime, right? This can range from a shoplift to a vandalism to all the way up to a murder, and a multiple murder. So we're not always going to roll out crime scene tape, police cars, barrier the side off, and that sort of thing. If it's a simple, someone keyed someone's car, for example, that may not merit a full-blown response, but you can still do a few things to protect the crime scene just with the way that you handle things. So here's an example of crime scene protection that might be used on a larger scene, such as a shooting in the middle of a street or a traffic accident or something where you have to block off traffic flow. So there's a couple of different perimeters, and well, actually there's a few different types of perimeters. And the initial perimeter is the best that we can do, honestly. Whenever you're at a chaotic crime scene, and we're talking about major cases where we have to block things off, you set up the initial perimeter to keep basically any onlookers, any people not involved with the investigation, and that sort of thing, including the media. We have to set up a good wide perimeter to make sure that we have as much evidence, or all evidence if we can, contained. Anytime you even let a camera person into a crime scene, that has the potential for contamination. Now, later on as we go, we establish two different perimeters. One is the inner crime scene perimeter, and that contains all of the evidence. So everything that we can find is in that inner crime scene perimeter. Now the outer crime scene perimeter is a little buffer area, and the reason why we do that is if someone shows up and attempts to break into the perimeter, we still have a little buffer zone where human security may be able to stop them from entering the actual evidence contained crime scene area, if that makes sense. So the inner perimeters, it's nice if you have like an apartment or a house or something like that. It's pretty easy to control that inner perimeter, and then we might establish an outer. The entire crime may have occurred within the residence, so you could establish the outer perimeter as the yard, because there's no evidence in the yard, so you just want to keep people from walking into the yard. When you have an outdoor crime scene, it's a little more of a challenge because you may not have natural physical barriers to keep people from entering. Note taking is a big part of the process when you first arrive at a crime scene, from the first responder onward. So we're kind of talking about, though, in this particular section, crime scene investigators. So whoever it is who may be processing the crime scene, which, as we discussed, can vary based upon the size of a department. But essentially, notes will include things about whenever you were contacted, when you were sent to the scene, and when you arrived, and when other people arrived too. And we have a contamination log, which I think we'll talk about later, that tells you who exactly was at the scene. Notes will also contain just the general condition as you found it. Of course, we have things like photographs and video that we'll take too, which we'll talk about throughout the course, but notes can replace those. So even if somehow those photographs are lost and you still have the notes, they should be thorough enough that you can kind of refresh your memory about what was going on when you arrived. So again, kind of reiterating what we said early on, saving life is the number one priority. So if we have somebody who's been shot or stabbed or something like that, if it is possible to save their life, um, then we should try. Now, and we'll talk about later in the course too, certain signs of death when they are present, there's no chance of saving an individual's life. Basically, if we have to move the party, we should make note of how they were when we found them. We don't have time to take pictures. That, again, is another indicator of why notes are so important. Sometimes you just simply do not have time to take a picture. And also the condition. So, were their clothes bloody or soiled or ripped, or how did you find them? Whether there's anything in their hands. So, if there's ever a claim of self-defense from the victim, we can look at the notes and see, well, there was nothing in their hand. There was no firearm or anything when we found them. So medical personnel is very important, and it is always good if you do have a party who is injured, but we feel pretty confident they're going to be okay, to send an officer with that individual in the ambulance ride down there. You never quite know when they might make a statement, kind of a dying declaration of who the potential suspect could have been or what happened. So it's always good to see if you can get an officer into the ambulance, and in most cases you can try to do that. And it serves a secondary purpose too of protection. So whoever did this to the person, you never know when they could be waiting at the hospital or something like that. In many cases, you'll find too that emergency personnel who are attempting to render life-saving aid, the clothing gets in the way, so it's not uncommon to see them take scissors or shears and cut the clothing off instead of trying to carefully remove it. Particularly when it's something like a t-shirt or something, they're not going to try to pull it over their head. They'll just cut it off. So it's good to recover that clothing, but also make note of the damage that was done by the medical personnel. And medical personnel, for the most part, are trained in pretty rudimentary crime scene investigation procedures and how important it is to try to preserve evidence as it was originally found. So again, we kind of referred to this a couple slides back, but there are certain signs of death that if they are present, there no medical intervention is going to help. And these include rigor mortis, odor of death, which is real pungent. It's hard to describe, but if the certain odor that you recognize from training and experience exists, you're not going to bring the individual back. Of course, rigor, I kind of passed over that real quick. That's basically a stiffening of the joints after death. Lividity is the pooling of blood to the lowest levels of gravity in a body. So if you see this cherry reddening, kind of darkening of the skin, that's lividity, and that's another indicator that it is too late. And decomposition, obviously, of course, means you're too late to do any life-saving efforts that will be successful. The less we can tamper with the crime scene, the better. And of course, we have to tamper with the crime scene in order to process it and in order to render saving aid as well. But in most cases, the most we can do not to disturb it, the better. You'll have curious onlookers not only from the public, but sometimes other police officers or commanders will want to see the crime scene, and you really should not allow them in unless there's a good bona fide reason that they should be in order to aid the investigation. Not uncommon for people to know that first responders are coming to the house, and in the few minutes it takes between their 911 phone call and the arrival of those first responders to try to do a little bit of cleanup to save some embarrassment. Well, they may inadvertently mess with some evidence during the course of that cleanup innocently, but still it can kind of hurt the investigative process. Always good to have that whoever that first officer was at the scene, have him or her stick around, because you'll see too, investigators may have questions such as, well, what did you find here? Why is this like this or that like that? And they may be able to explain the condition of evidence or the scene. Always consider too, particularly with outdoor scenes, what do you think the route of the suspect was both in and out of the scene if they are no longer present? You'll also want to be cautious because you can have things like footprints or shoe prints that you'll need to recover that can be found in the route. Whoever called 911 too and notified the police, if it wasn't a police-led discovery where the police rolled up on the scene and just found it, if somebody called you and you can get them to stay at the scene, that is good for the same reason as keeping the officer at the scene, because you may encounter questions where you have to contact that initial reporting party and ask if they found the scene. Again, easier to protect in indoor scenes, we kind of already referred to. The outdoor scene's a little bit tougher, and you have to look for potential routes of entry and exit. It's easier in a home because usually that you can see the front door or the window or whatever it may be, and that's the natural route of entry and exit. Protecting a scene can be as simple as locking a door. Crime scene tape obviously works too. Most people recognize what that is. Obviously, people can walk over and under crime scene tape, but just the physical, visual, presence of that barrier tells most people I shouldn't pass this line. Vehicles can be used too, particularly effective in street scenes, but you really can't beat a police officer. That's about the best crime scene barrier you can have, as an actual human saying you cannot go past here. And this is a view of the World Trade Center post September 11th, and that is a crime scene. So you can kind of see it varies from everything from an apartment building that we've talked about, an apartment in a building, to something as enormous as this. This is a crime scene, and they probably found debris scattered about for probably at least a mile or two. So you can imagine how difficult certain crime scenes are. Even a shooting that goes a couple blocks in a city area, that's very tough. This is the Boston bombing explosions, and you see you had actually two explosions that occurred. So two different crime scenes, again with debris probably everywhere, as well as subsequent scenes such as where shootouts occurred with the two, where the one was found in a boat. So there's all kinds of different primary and secondary crime scenes involving the Boston bombing. So what is a primary and secondary scene? And this is where you have to be cautious. A primary scene is just where the crime occurred, and a secondary scene is somehow related. So you could have multiple secondary scenes. Now, where you find a body, you might consider that a primary scene, but that's not always true. So take, for example, if a murder happened, and we see in a picture here of a house with the door open, and then we see another picture of where they took the body from this house and then dumped it on the side of the road. The primary scene is where the crime occurred. So where that homicide occurred, which in this case is this house, that's our primary, and the secondary is where the body was dumped. A bank robbery. You have a bank robbery in a bank. That's where the crime occurred, and that's the primary scene. But we may have caught the suspect 2 miles away after a short car chase, and they've got all the cash. Ton of evidence there to work, but that's the secondary scene. And they may have tossed some cash out the window on the route in the car chase, and there may be multiple secondary scenes. So this is kind of how it works with regard to a homicide investigation or a suspicious death investigation. Your coroner or your medical examiner, and we'll talk about the difference between the two. The coroner or the medical examiner has what they call jurisdiction over the body. So all the evidence that is on the body really is processed by your coroner or medical examiner, and the rationale for that being they're trained medical experts, and police officers are not, at least to that level, that's for sure. Everything else, though, is under the purview and jurisdiction of the police department and the investigators. So we always say don't move that body until you get permission from that coroner or medical examiner. They are responsible for the body. We're responsible for everything else. We'll kind of get a little bit, and we'll touch upon these further later. But just generally, hanging scenes. There's obvious signs of death with these two, such as lividity and rigor mortis too. And the important thing with these is to not alter the condition that we find the noose, because the noose and the hanging groove are important to match the body. Not need to worry too much about that because we'll get into more detail later. Firearms is another piece of evidence that we often encounter. In general, it says if you don't have to move them, don't. But in many cases, as you would imagine, you do. So if you have citizens still walking around and there's a firearm at the scene, you really don't want to leave it there, where it could be kicked or it could be picked up or it could be fired. So you sometimes have to move those. And in those cases, they say pick up the firearm, and this is important to remember, by the checkered portion of the hand grips. So you can kind of see it in this picture if you're looking. The hand grips are where you actually grip the gun. It's checkered, so it's not very conducive to fingerprints. It may be conducive to DNA, but not necessarily fingerprints, so that's one of the better places to get it. If you have to alter that firearm, such as unloading, it's very important to note the condition in which you found the weapon. So was the safety on? Were there rounds in the chamber and that sort of thing? We'll talk about that more when we get to firearms evidence. Any way that you alter that firearm in order to make it safe, you have to detail in a report how you changed it. And that kind of goes with any sort of changes to the crime scene. Anything that you do to alter it, as you may have already figured out, you should write in a report what you did and how you did it. Sometimes it's a nice, easy investigation when we actually locate a suspect at the scene. We want to remove them from the scene or take them out of the scene as quickly as possible. And the reason for that, obviously, is they have a potential to cross-contaminate the scene. So they could be losing hair or skin cells, or they could be touching things and leaving fingerprints, or suspect could even be bleeding. So the longer you leave him or her there, the more they have the potential to contaminate the scene. Search them quickly and get them out of there and take them away. So it's very common that police officers respond to a scene and they handle it, and then they have to wait a period of time for some investigators to show up so they can take over the scene. Basically, you police officers have the scene and then they're in control for a while, and then they pass the responsibility over to investigators to show up. So there's lots of things that you can do during that time. Obviously, you want to identify everyone who is at the scene who may have been a witness. Write down the names of people who enter and exit, and do what we call a contamination log. So basically, that means anyone who enters the scene may have altered it in some way, and we need to know who entered and who exited. Note who was at the scene when you first arrived, and kind of uh, figure out the basic facts of what happened. And the important thing too is also to keep witnesses separate. I worked a shooting once where we had about 7 witnesses, and we had to separate them apart because you don't want them talking to each other and comparing notes, because that can tend to alter people's perceptions of what actually occurred. Don't let them compare notes, so basically, and don't discuss the crime yourself with people who are in the area, because you can alter their perceptions too. Listen, though, because you'll find in some cases people say things that are very interesting and can contribute to the investigation. Protect any evidence you have there at the scene, and finally, don't talk to the media. There should be one central source who discusses things with the media from the police department's perspective. So we kind of referred to this already. The command of the scene, who is in control? First of all, that first officer who is there, it starts with him or her. Then if a supervisor shows up, it gets turned over to that supervisor. And finally, investigators will show up after that, and it goes to them. So it can change based upon the condition of the scene.